Give me some thumbs up so I know I edited out that beginning part. Last week we talked about blood and went through the different things about blood and how blood is different and lots of different stuff. Question from the last test, a lot of people messed up on. I told you, remember, is blood is connective tissue, even though it's liquid, even though it's filling out your whole body, it's connective tissue because it arises from mesenchyme. But blood is going to be doing all the things to carry all the stuff all over your body. How do we get that blood moving? It's what we're going to talk about today and probably tomorrow as well. Um, and that's the heart. Um, the heart is something that if you go back, first off, we need to talk about a little bit of heart development. Um, if you, we talked about coelomates versus acoelomates at the beginning of the year, things that have an internal body cavity and animals that don't. So your first animals didn't even have any internal body cavity at all. So they were just cells packed on top of cells, packed on top of cells. If you have that, you don't need a circulatory system, because the cells can just transmit what they need from cell to cell to cell, and there's no point in having any type of circulatory system. As animals got bigger and as they got these internal body cavities, they needed to start moving things around their body. And so your first types of circulatory system, your roundworms and your arthropods, your insects, had this thing called an open circulatory system. What an open circulatory system pretty much is that the entire body of the organism is full of blood, and the blood just moves around. Now that works as long as you stay small. This is why you'll never have human-sized spiders or human-sized crickets. You know, you can get some big roaches, but you can only get so big with a circulatory system that just blobs around, with a circulatory system that just flows by normal movement of liquid. Like there's nothing driving the circulatory system around an insect or a roundworm or a crab. You know, you can have giant lobsters, but those crabs and lobsters can get so big because they live in an environment where the pressure is different. Under the water, you're more suspended. You don't have to move as quickly sometimes, and you can, you know, just kind of have that body. But those are still pretty rare. You know, even your largest, your lobsters are still the size of a small dog. Once you get bigger, you have to be able to deliver it. And so you have a closed circulatory system. Now, some closed circulatory systems, if you go back 2 billion years ago to your first closed circulatory systems, you had these things called aortic arches. It wasn't a heart, it was like an earthworm, where you have thickened arteries that have little muscles around them that just kind of keep the blood flowing. And that works as long as you stay small. And for an earthworm, you can actually get really big, and you can have these giant earthworms that are the size of, you know, saucers that are that big around, that live in South Africa, I think South America. But they can be really big because their whole body's a muscle. And so like this whole peristalsis moves the blood around anyway. So it kind of acts like their whole body kind of acts like a heart. You look up giant earthworms. I think they got some big ones. Yeah, see? There you go. He trying to call my bluff there. All right. So, but to really be effective, you got to be able to pump that blood around the body. So the first heart was fish. So we're talking, 2 billion years ago. You have these first big fish species that live in the ocean. And they had the first true hearts with true circulatory systems. But their heart was very different than ours, because the fish have gills. Gills get oxygen out of water. Now, we think of getting oxygen out of water, we think that's tough. It's tough to get oxygen out of water, because when you put your head underwater, you getting any oxygen? No, because you're going to fill your lungs up with fluid, and you got a big problem. Because we don't breathe water. But fish, all they have to do to get oxygen is open their mouth, let the water flow into their mouth, go across their gills, and oxygen bubbles are filtered out through the water. Now, if you think about it, we breathe air in, we breathe nitrogen and oxygen and everything in our environment in, but then filter the oxygen particles out of a mixture that's all gas. Fish filter gas particles out of a mixture that's all water. So it's actually way easier to get oxygen out of the water than it is to get oxygen out of the air. And so fish use this system with gills, and it's a little bit easier to get that air out. And I'm going to draw this up here on the board, even though it doesn't have much to do with my notes. So a fish have a heart, and all the heart's going to do, and I'm not an ichthyologist, so if I get this out of order, I apologize, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to get it right. But yeah, fish have a heart that looks kind of like this. A two-chambered heart. Blood comes into the atria from the body. Blood goes out of the ventricle, across the gills, out to the body, used up, and then back to the heart. This is called single loop circulation. Single loop circulation, super simple. It works great because it is easy to get oxygen out of the water as long as there's oxygen there. If there's no oxygen there, you got a fish kill, you got a problem. Okay? But this is a two-chambered heart. It's the simplest heart, and fish did just fine with it and are doing just fine with it today. But then you had a certain group of organisms that said, hey, a lot of predators in the ocean. Let me get out on that land, and I can get away from the predators. I can live a little bit better. You had your amphibians. You had your amphibians that spent part of their life cycle in the water, part of their life cycle on land. And this doesn't work so well on land because you need a more efficient way to get the blood to the oxygen source and then get the blood out to the body. And so what your amphibians actually changed up the strategy. An amphibian's heart looks kind of like this. Looks actually kind of like a heart. Amphibian's going to get blood from their body to their right atrium. Then it's going to go down the right atrium into their only one ventricle. It's going to leave there, go to their lungs. Now, amphibians have all kinds of different lungs. Some amphibians have fully formed lungs that are similar to ours. Some amphibians have what's called a book lung, which is it's called a book lung because it's like layers of flat things, kind of like what a crab has for its lungs or for its gills. And then some amphibians just absorb air, like a frog will actually absorb oxygen through its skin into the bloodstream. But wherever it's getting its oxygen source from, the blood pumps to here. So we pick up the O2, then we go back to the heart. Then the same ventricle is going to pump the blood out to the body. Now, this is efficient because you're forcing blood to go get that oxygen. But what might happen? You got a ventricle, you got one ventricle that's pumping blood both to get the oxygen and out to the body. You might pump blood that maybe hasn't picked up the oxygen yet. So sending venous blood, deoxygenated blood out to the body is a possibility for amphibians. This is also the strategy for reptiles. This is why if just about any species, if you give me a similar sized mammal versus a similar sized amphibian or reptile, who's going to win the race? And I'm talking long distance, not sprint, mile-long race. Who's winning the race? You versus a snake. Who's running the mile first? Quick. Yeah. Okay. Mammals are going to win the race just about every time. Now, there might be obviously a snake has the coil thing, and they might beat you over a 10-foot span. But when it comes to long distance exertion, you got to be able to have consistent oxygenated blood, and this does not provide that. It also has to do with ectothermic and endothermic, and I'm not really getting into that. So then you had the next step in heart evolution, which leads us to mammals and birds. And that's what we're going to talk about today, the four-chambered heart. We're going to talk about the four-chambered heart, which has a true left side and right side, which keeps the oxygenated blood completely separate from the deoxygenated blood. It provides a very, very efficient delivery of oxygen, while at the same time forcing blood to go get the oxygen from the lungs. Now, why do you think? It's pretty clear why fish do what they do. Life is simple, rock and roll, it works great, carry on. It's pretty clear why amphibians and reptiles, hey, it's working for them, carry on. Mammals we'll talk about all today because we're mammals. Why are birds like us? Why do you think a bird needs a four-chambered heart more than, because if you look at bird history, birds are closest to what other group? Reptiles. Yeah, birds came from dinosaurs. Birds are pretty close to reptiles. If you look at a bird, a chicken leg, and put it beside a lizard leg, they look similar. They got some scales and stuff. They look similar. So why do you think birds are more like us than they are their reptile brothers and sisters when it comes to hearts?
Polite.
Yeah. Do you ever want any oxygen to not be delivered? Because if your oxygen doesn't get delivered appropriately, maybe that muscle doesn't work right. If you're a crocodile and your muscle doesn't work right, you catch a cramp. If you're a heron and your muscle doesn't work right, you're dead. Okay? So let's roll on. That's a neat enough introduction. Let's roll on with the heart here. So the anatomy of the heart, the gross anatomy, about the size of your fist. If you ever want to know what your heart is, take your fist and take your wrist and put your wrist on your sternum. Put your wrist on your sternum. Right there is your heart. Okay? Now, our heart is kind of wiggled to the left. That's why I say put your wrist on your sternum, because your heart is oriented to the left, because we're bipedal. When you guys look and see what a cat looks like, the heart of the cat is much more central because everything is stretched out and not squished like our thorax. Our thorax is very, very compact, superior to inferior, and it actually takes our heart and squeezes it over to the left side of our body. Around the heart, you have the pericardium. Pericardium is a super strong, dense connective tissue that's going to enclose the heart. It's got two walls. It's got one that's a little bit easier to break into, and then another one that you really gotta cut open to get into it. Then once you get down to the actual heart, pericardium is just the covering over it. Once you get down to the heart, you have the myocardium and the endocardium. Myocardium is the majority of the heart. It's why the heart is red when you see it. It is, yes, it's flushed with blood, but it's also muscle. Heart is cardiac muscle, and most of the heart wall is muscle. If you look at my heart right here, bring it over here so everybody can see it. They were kind enough with this heart model to slice it open for us. And if you look at the heart there, most of it is going to be this muscle that looks just like muscle if you dissected a bicep or something like that. Now, microscopically, we know it looks a little bit different because it's cardiac muscle rather than skeletal muscle. But remember, it does have striations. It does not look like smooth muscle. Okay? Then on the inside of each of the chambers of the heart, you have endocardium. This is really important because without that endocardium, the blood actually will be absorbed by the muscle and used right there in the heart. Why don't you want to use the blood inside the heart for the heart?
Because on half the heart is not going to be oxygenated, right?
Okay, because there's no oxygen, very little oxygen on the right side of the heart. So yeah, I'll buy that. But what problem would it be for the rest of the body? Well, if you use up all the oxygen in your blood while it's in the heart, you're not going to be able to deliver the oxygen to the body. And so you want to have the heart, the blood in the heart, not available to the muscle of the heart. That's why you have all these things we'll talk about in a second, all these guys on the outside of the heart, which is your coronary circulation. So it's pretty interesting little deal there. All right. So let's go through the heart. Going to start with this big blue guy right here. This is your vena cava. And I'm pointing down there, I should be pointing right here. This is your vena cava. When you do a dissection of the heart and you pull the heart out, it's going to be the one of the only, can I get it all? Yeah. All right. One of the only holes on the bottom of your heart. So it always is able to orient yourself, because if you look at the top of your heart, it's hard to figure out what's going on sometimes, especially on dissection, because you don't have all the colors. But you can always look at the bottom of the heart and see you only got one hole. That hole is the inferior vena cava. Vena cava, because it is the cavernous vessel, cavernous vein, and then inferior because it's on the bottom, underneath. Inferior vena cava, and if you take your probe on dissection and stick it inside the inferior vena cava and keep pushing, eventually it'll come out the superior vena cava. So superior vena cava up here, this would be like a jugular vein going up to the neck right here. So superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, all going in to the right atrium. They're on the right-hand side. Remember, right and left when you're talking anatomy is the patient's right and left. So don't get confused on right and left today. I know I'm backwards and it might be different from if you're looking on the video versus in your class. But right is always right, left is always left. So you have the right atrium, which receives all of the blood in the body. Atria are on top. Atrium in architecture, what is an atrium? You go into a building and see the atrium. What are you looking at?
Like a big room, right?
More than that. Usually it's when you first walk into a really, really fancy, nice building, you walk into the lobby and the lobby has an atrium. A ceiling that's really, really high and usually glass. A lot of times you can see through it. Atrium's the top, the ceiling. Okay? So atrium's our top. Guys, we have the right and the left atrium. The right atrium is receiving blood from the body through the vena cava. Going down from the right atrium, you have your tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve, easy way to remember tricuspid valve and bicuspid valve is you're going to ride a tricycle before you ride a bicycle. They're named by that because they have three little valves versus two little valves. But the tricuspid valve is going to lead you down to the right ventricle. So right atrium, tricuspid valve, leads you down into the right ventricle. Right ventricle down here on the right side of the heart. Right ventricle is going to then pump blood up and out through the pulmonary trunk. Pulmonary trunk is what you call, you have the pulmonary semilunar valve or pulmonary valve to the pulmonary trunk, then through the pulmonary arteries. Now, we're going to the lungs, which means our blood does not have oxygen, which means these are the only arteries in the body which contain deoxygenated blood. The only arteries in the body that have deoxygenated blood are your pulmonary arteries. Because artery and vein does not mean whether or not you have oxygen. Artery and vein have to do with the direction you're flowing. If you're going away from the heart, you're an artery. If you're going back to the heart, you're a vein. So the pulmonary arteries right here going to either lung. Blood goes to the lungs, picks up oxygen. We'll talk about how that works later. Gets that oxygen and then goes into the very, very back of the heart through your four pulmonary arteries, there's veins, pulmonary veins, because it's going to the heart. I always think about this, it looks kind of like a TV mount to me, where you have these little, it's the very back of the heart, and you got these four little guys right here. Those are the pulmonary veins. They're the only veins in the body that have oxygen. All your veins in your body are deoxygenated blood except for your pulmonary veins. Pulmonary veins are going to go into the left atrium. So on the left side of the heart, our left atrium, we're receiving blood. Then we're going to let that fall down through the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve always kind of a pet peeve of mine. I wish that since everybody agreed that the tricuspid valve is here, the bicuspid valve is here, but a lot of times people say mitral valve instead of bicuspid valve. It's the same thing. Whether or not you hear somebody say bicuspid valve or mitral valve, that's the same thing. I usually say bicuspid, but sometimes I'll say mitral. It's the same thing. Lead you down to the left ventricle. Left ventricle, left side of your heart, probably the most important part of your heart, because what it's going to do is pump blood and send it everywhere. Sends it out through the aortic valve, through the aorta, to your entire body. If you want to see whether or not a heart is healthy, you can look at the left ventricle. The left ventricle is probably the most important, because if that goes down, you lose everything. You lose the ability to get blood out to your heart, or from your heart. So the left ventricle sending blood through the aortic valve, and then from the aorta to the entire body. This is something we already mentioned here with the coronary circulation. What's the man? Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. What's the famous line? Come on, Quiz Bowl. Water, water everywhere. You are pitiful. Fire from Quiz Bowl. I've been talking too much today. We got to sneeze. Ooh, man, that was snuck up. The Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the famous. I'm allergic to it. The famous line is, water, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. Okay? The idea was the guy was in the ocean, surrounded by water, but still thirsty as crap because you can't even drink that salt water. I like to think of the heart as blood, blood everywhere, not a drop to give me any oxygen. Because you have these muscles in the heart that are inundated with blood. They're full of blood. But they can't use that oxygen because they got to send that oxygen out to the body because they can't get it through the endocardium. So you got to have your coronary circulation. Now, I'm not going to be a mean anatomy teacher and expect you to know your left anterior coronary artery and blah, 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 blah. One day you'll have to learn that, not in here. What I need you to know is that these guys here, these blood vessels sitting on top of the heart, are some of the most important blood vessels for your survival on this earth. Because if one of those guys gets clogged up, that's where we're talking about a heart attack. Heart attack is where you have a prolonged lack of blood flow to heart muscle. The heart muscle stops. You end up not being able to deliver blood. If you don't take care of it quick, you got a dead person. Myocardial infarction, heart attack, this is where your coronary blood supply gets blocked in some way. Now, you do have a bunch of different vessels going all over the place, so if you have a little blockage, a lot of times other things can help out. But if you got a big blockage on a main artery, unless you can break it up quick, unless you can take some nitro to open up that artery, you got a real problem. You got an arrhythmia, you got a death. All right. I usually print this off and give it to you, but obviously we're all over the place. So I was able to scan this guy into our notes. Love this image. This image gives you so much information. Like, this maybe is second place behind the periodic table with most information in science class on a single image. If you look at the bottom, this is by time, and you're getting all of this over the same amount of time. And in my notes will actually go with each of the vertical columns here, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and we'll stop when we hit G today. So we're going to go through each step of the cardiac cycle. We'll stop when we hit G today. It'll be a good stopping point. And talk about kind of what's happening. So look at some of the things that this is showing you first off. At the very bottom, you have electrocardiogram. Electrocardiogram, ECG, sometimes called EKG because it was developed in, I believe, Russia and spelled different, but whatever. This is the electricity, the electrical signals that are being sent to your heart to keep the pace. PQRST, is just letters that get assigned those bumps on the electrocardiogram. Why they chose those letters, I do not know. Maybe because it'd be unique. The main electrical signal is the QRS wave. That's the you need to contract wave, and we'll talk about that more in just a second. Then you see your pulse. Normally, when you're feeling pulse, you feel like you're only feeling one thing at a time, but what you're feeling is really three things, and we're counting this as one. Ventricular volume is just the amount of blood in your ventricles. Pretty straightforward. They fill up, pumps out, fills back up. You have your heart sounds. We're going to talk a little bit about heart sounds today. And if you look up there, there's 4 different heart sounds. Now, when you listen to it on a stethoscope, you're really only going to hear 2, unless something's wrong. Normally, you're just going to hear the first and second heart sounds. We'll talk about what those are. Lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. Then you got your pressures, just showing you the amount of pressure as it changes in each of the left atrium. This is the aorta, and this is the left ventricle. All right. So let's check out each step, and I might come back to this as we talk. All right. So the first thing, A, is atrial systole. First, we got to deal with those 2 words, systole and diastole. Where have we heard those words before? You've heard them before, even if you say you haven't. You may not have heard somebody say systole and diastole. Instead, they probably used an adverb term of them or an adjective term of them. Instead of systole, they probably said systolic. Instead of diastole, they probably said diastolic. What are we talking? Pressure. Blood pressure. Blood pressure is systolic over diastolic. Which number is bigger? First number or second number?
Second.
Nope. Your blood pressure is going to be like 120 over 85. You with me? Okay. Systolic pressure, 120, the higher number, is your pressure when your heart contracts. It's the high pressure. It's the pressure when your heart contracts. Diastolic pressure is the low number. It's the pressure that's left over when your heart is relaxing. Systole, contraction. Diastole, relaxation. Cool? All right. Systole, atrial systole, means your atria is contracting. Now, if you look on this model, which is pretty true to life, the atria, the thickness of that wall, versus the ventricle, the thickness of that wall, atria is much, much thinner. There's much less cardiac muscle in the atria than in the ventricle. Why? Pretty simple.
The atrium is just pushing it into the ventricle is pushing it to the whole body or to the lungs.
First reason is distance. The atria has to move stuff from here to here. The ventricle has to move stuff either to the lungs or to the whole stinking body. So that's the first reason. There's one more reason. Think about orientation. What's going to help blood go from here to here? Atria don't got to do much. Atria's got to open the door and blood's gone. So there really doesn't have to be much of a contraction. So atrial systole, the P wave, is not a real big electrical signal because you're just kind of wiggling that blood out of the top of the heart. Doesn't take much energy. Atrial systole, the P wave ends, you get a small amount of ventricular filling, which is kind of the leftover thing, and usually an inaudible 4th heart sound. That inaudible 4th heart sound is just the small amount of increased pressure in the atrium splashing some blood around. Usually you can't hear it. It's the quietest of the 4 sounds right here. And usually it's not that big a deal. B, what's happening here in your second spot, if you look at it, you got your loudest heart sound. We're going to take pressure and just shoot it up like crazy. But what is not changing? The ventricular volume. So our ventricles are full, and you have isovolumetric ventricular contraction. Now that sounds so complicated, but if you break down the word, it is so easy. Iso means what? Isolate's a root word of it, but think about like isosceles. two sides that are the same. Iso in science means two things that are the same. Isovolumetric means our volume has remained the same. We're not changing our volume. Ventricular, your ventricles, contraction, squeeze, contraction. So what you're doing here is the function of the heart, but we aren't both of our AV valves are closed. Now, AV valves are the valves that are leading from my atria to my ventricles. So we haven't opened any valves. We just closed these valves. So all of my valves in my heart are closed, and I contracted, building up pressure. You squeezed the water balloon. If you think about it like, so you got a water balloon sitting on a table, and all of a sudden you squeeze it, you're building up the pressure so that when somebody pokes a hole in it, what's going to happen? It's going to shoot out more or less because of your pressure. More. You're building up the pressure. It's where you get your QRS wave, which is, if you see it, electrocardiogram, that's the jump, is the QRS wave. It's just a strong electrical signal. And that pressure forces the blood to smack against the closed wall. And that's that loud heart sound. This is one of the most biggest misconceptions in cardiophysiology, is what's making the sound. Because everybody's seen, maybe, you might have seen a YouTube video of like a heart beating. You maybe even saw a YouTube video of maybe a heart beating from the inside. And if you look at a heart beating from the inside, what it makes you think you're hearing is the opening and closing of the valves. The opening and closing of the valves is just as silent as any other muscle in your body. Muscles moving in your body don't make any noise. Those papillary muscles pulling the valve open and close are just as silent as anything. The sound comes from the blood hitting the closed door. And the sound's going to stop as soon as the door opens. So, see, that door opens. Your semilunar valves, your pulmonary valve, and your aortic valve open up, and blood can go from the ventricles either to the lungs or out to the body. Rapid ventricular ejection. The valves open, the blood leaves the ventricles. This is the flow of blood here in the third step. Blood is gone. And that's where you feel your pulse. You feel your pulse because the blood is all rushing out. You're feeling that pulse because that blood is all rushing out. And then the next step, you have reduced ventricular ejection. The ventricular pressure drops, the blood flow slows, you get your T wave. The T wave is an electrical signal that's showing repolarization. Remember we talked about nerve signals? We talked about you have to make it negative and then go back to normal. The T wave is representing going back to normal. Goes back to normal so that you can do it again. Doesn't really have much of an effect up here. You just slow down. You slow down the blood flow. Then you get between steps D and E, you close your valves back again. Your aortic and your pulmonary valves close, and you get your second heart sound because you never pump all the blood out of your heart. On every pump, you're pumping a bunch of blood out, you're pumping most of it out, but you leave some blood in your heart because things work better if you don't completely dry them out. I know that sounds kind of a layman's way to say it, but you always have a little bit of residual blood left in your heart. And that residual blood that was flowing out, that was coming out of your ventricle, when that door closes on it, splashes up against it. And you get your second heart sound. So the first heart sound was to build up pressure. The second heart sound was that little bit of blood that's left behind. That's why the first heart sound is louder. That's why the tone of the sounds are different. Love do, love do, love do. Okay? So you get isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. The aortic and pulmonary valves close. The residual blood splashes against it, causing the second heart sound. We're not changing our volume. We're relaxing our muscles to be able to do it all again. Then during this time, passively, the aortic, the atria have been filling back up because blood just flows back to the heart through this whole system. And so passively, the atria have been filling up through this whole time. And now we got to get that blood back out of there. And so you're going to fill the ventricles back up. The AV valve's open, blood flows from the atria to the ventricles. You get this third heart sound. In babies, in infants, in some toddlers, you can hear this third heart sound because it's a little bit of blood splashing down in the heart. And it's a whole lot easier to hear the sound with a small little heart. And so in babies, you might hear it's going to be much faster, but instead of just lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, you might hear lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, like just a little bit of an extra little beat on the heartbeat. Okay? In adults, it means something's wrong because it means that a valve is not opening or closing properly and you have blood flowing where it shouldn't be, something like that. Then you have diastasis. Diastasis is your longest phase. It's the rest between your heartbeat. Nothing's really happening. It's your rest phase, rest period between heartbeats. And this is what controls your heart rate. I say nothing's happening, but this is what controls your heart rate. Every heartbeat should always be the same. Love done. What changes is the distance between the heartbeat. So when the pretty girl walks in and your heart starts beating faster, it's not that your heartbeats changed, it's that the gaps between heartbeats got smaller. When you're relaxing on the edge of the mountain and everything's perfect in the universe and your heartbeat slows down to 40, 45 beats per minute, it's not that your heartbeats have changed, it's that the distance between heartbeats have increased. Here's a question for you. That's a good stopping point for today, but just a couple questions about that. What's the healthiest heart rate? What's the target for a resting heart rate?
For an adult?
Yep.
Like 85, isn't it? Between 85 and 90?
That'd be an active heart rate. If your heart rate's 85 or 90, you're doing something. 60, 65 is normal. Okay? Between 50 and 65 for resting heart rate is going to be normal. But that's not really what I asked. What's the goal? What's the best? It's like would a 45 resting heartbeat be good? It's a pretty easy answer. And y'all are thinking too hard. Okay? The best resting heart rate is as low as you can possibly go without hypoxia. So if your heart rate is 22 beats per minute and your nail beds aren't blue and your lips aren't blue, you just got a great heart. You're a healthy fella. You bring me a cyclist, somebody who's in the best shape possible, a long distance marathon runner, and have them sit down here and relax, they'll probably get their heart rate down in the 30s. Because their stroke volume and their efficiency of their heart, we're going to talk about tomorrow, is so trained and well controlled. Flip side of that, if your resting heart rate is 75 or 80, you probably got a heart that's not as healthy. Well, I mean, you probably, and there's lots of other things that go into that too. I'm not trying to rip on people. All right, nobody joined us. I don't have any questions for the chat. I'm going to end that meeting.